Hey, I'm Robert Vinlow, and I'm from New York Times Games, and I'm here talking to people about Wordle and the Wordle Archive. Do you all play Wordle?
I play it every day.
All right, I have something exciting to show you. It's the Wordle Archive.
What?
Oh, okay, that's awesome.
So now you can play every Wordle that has ever existed. There's like 1,000 puzzles.
What?
Wordle Archive.
Oh, cool.
Now you can do yesterday's Wordle if you missed it.
Yeah. New York Times Games subscribers can now access the entire Wordle Archive. Find out more at nytimes.com/games.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Matt Bishop, and I'm absolutely delighted to be back with my friend and co-host, Richard Williams, for Season 3 of our podcast. How have you been, Richard?
All fine, thanks, Matt, and you're looking pretty good yourself. As you say, it's great to be back with our third season of the pod. And while I don't want to give too much away, we're going to be bringing you some terrific stories in this next run of 10 episodes, starting right now. Regular listeners will know we ended Season 2 with a two-parter on Bernie Ecclestone. And we're starting Season 3 in similar fashion, with a two-parter on none other than Enzo Ferrari, the founder of motor racing's most illustrious and celebrated marque.
Yes, certainly one of the most influential figures in motor racing history, and, if I may say so, in all sporting history too. But perhaps also one of the most important industrialists of the 20th century, if I can use that word. Would you agree, Richard?
Industrialist, that's an interesting choice of term. And maybe a good one from a certain perspective, because he built his business from scratch. He played a big role in ensuring that fast cars were surrounded by an air of glamour and romance in the 20th century. And then he sold half the company to a much bigger one, while retaining control of it until his death. And that's a classic progression.
Fiat, you mean, obviously.
Fiat, yeah. Indeed.
Yeah.
But above all, of course, he was a racer. That's how he started out, and it's what he remained.
So he was a racer and an industrialist, I think we can agree. Having said that, I'm extremely lucky to have you on this particular podcast, Richard. Well, actually, I'm always lucky to share the podcast with you. But in this particular case, you are a 24-carat Enzo Ferrari expert, having written one of the definitive biographies of the great man, entitled Enzo Ferrari, A Life. How long did it take you to think of that title, by the way?
I don't know, I left that to the publisher.
Anyway, it's a great read, and I'd urge anyone listening to buy a copy.
Well, that's too kind, but of course other fine Enzo Ferrari biographies are available.
They are indeed. But anyway, the blurb to your very fine book reads, quote, "For tens of millions of people around the world, a single name evokes the world of speed, Enzo Ferrari. Today's Formula One would be unthinkable without the presence of the Ferrari cars on the grid. Win or lose, Ferrari attract more fans than all the other teams combined. And the car's unique appeal, their mystique, their myth, has its origins in the story of one man with a dictator's will and the cunning of a Machiavelli." Ooh. End quote. Well, golden words, Richard, golden words.
The blurb writers, not mine.
Well, very good they are too. And I think it's a terrific summation, because the legend and appeal of Ferrari really is, to this day, wrapped up in the mystique, the myth, the romance that surround its founder. And it's not quite like that for any other automotive manufacturer.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in this episode, the first of two, as I mentioned, we're going to rewind to the very start of the Enzo Ferrari story. We'll trace his life's journey all the way up to the point that his team wins its first World Championship Formula One race, before hitting pause ahead of part 2.
Yes, and it's a fascinating story. And I'm guessing, Richard, given you chose to write a book about him, that you've always found Enzo Ferrari, the man himself, an absolutely fascinating character. Is that a fair guess?
It is. As a small boy in the 50s, I fell for the mystique of Italian racing cars. They were Ferraris and Maseratis mostly at the time. And I wanted to know more about them. And it soon became very obvious that the man behind one of those marques, Enzo Ferrari, was someone with a charisma to match the best of his drivers.
Absolutely.
Just as fascinating.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the first time I visited the Ferrari factory in Maranello in 1977, he was actually in the office. I didn't get to meet him.
What a shame. It'd be lovely to say that you had.
Wouldn't it? But
Yes.
I was with a friend. I was with a friend who was actually a rock star and was a good customer of Ferrari at the time. And he didn't get to meet him either.
Are we going to hear who the rock star
We're
was?
not, no. Suffice it to say, it's a long time since he had a hit.
Okay.
But anyway, but you can visit the Vatican without getting to meet the Pope. And one of the nicknames for Ferrari was the Pope of the North. So in these 2 episodes, we'll try to build up a picture of a remarkable man.
Well, yes. So let's get started on the story of the Pope of the North then, shall we? And, by the way, as we've already said, the name Ferrari evokes speed, probably more powerfully than any other name, in fact, and exoticism too, I think we can say, and yet Ferrari is actually quite a common run-of-the-mill surname in Italy, is it not? It means smith, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. In Italian, ferro means iron, so Ferrari is the equivalent of blacksmith or just smith. It's a name that sounds very exotic to us, it certainly did to a small boy, but it's actually the 3rd most common surname in Italy, after Rossi and Russo.
I thought you were going to say after Maserati and Lamborghini.
Good.
But anyway, I think that qualifies as the first anorak fact of Series 3 of Colossally. That's history, Richard, so well done. And if I may say so, I've always thought that the fact that Ferrari means smith, or equates most closely to smith anyway, explains a lot about the passionate fervour of the tifosi. Put it this way. For many years, Formula One was pretty much a battle between one Italian team, Ferrari, and a gaggle of British teams, BRM, Lotus, Brabham, McLaren, Williams, it goes on, Tyrrell, March, Shadow, Surtees, Ensign, Hesketh, etc. Well, just imagine if the boot had, for all those years, been on the other foot. Just imagine that for all those years, Formula One had been pretty much a battle between one British team and a gaggle of Italian teams. And just imagine that one British team had been called Smith. Well, we British Formula One fans would have felt pretty proud of Smith, wouldn't we? And we'd have supported them with absolute patriotic fervour, and we'd have celebrated long and loud whenever they won, wouldn't we?
Well, that's an interesting perspective, and it's one I confess I hadn't previously considered. So the equivalent of Forza Ferrari would be, come on, Smith.
Exactly so, or even, come on, you Smiths!
Yes, okay.
Possibly. Possibly. That surprised you.
Why have the same ring?
Anyway, we digress. So let's go back to 1898, February the 18th, 1898 to be exact, because that's when Enzo Ferrari was born, in the town of Modena, whose population was then about 50,000. It's about 4 times that now. And Modena is in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. I say that's when he was born, but there's actually some dispute about that, because his birth certificate records the date as February the 20th. Ferrari himself always claimed that the discrepancy was the result of heavy snow in the region, which prevented his father getting to the registry office to register the birth for 2 days. But according to Luca Dal Monte, another Enzo Ferrari biographer.
And a very fine one, I must say.
And absolutely a very fine one. It's more likely that baby Enzo was in poor health when he was born. In Italy at the time, let's not forget, 1 baby in every 4 died before their 5th birthday, which is a terrible statistic by today's standards. And just to add more context to the world in which Enzo Ferrari was born in 1898, so Queen Victoria was still on the throne in the UK, William McKinley was President of the United States, wouldn't it be nice if he still were, and he was about to declare war on Spain, and Italy itself...
Is that a better idea than declaring war on Canada? Sorry.
Unfortunately, this is not the Rest is History podcast, but they can deal with the rest of that. Anyway, Italy itself had only been a unified country for a little over 30 years. So young Enzo's upbringing wasn't privileged, was it actually, Richard? But it's been said that he grew up more comfortably than some of his peers.
Yeah, well, his dad, Alfredo Ferrari, had begun his working life as an apprentice at a metal worker in Carpi, which is a village near Modena. And when he married a farmer's daughter, the beautiful Adalgisa Bisbini, they moved to Modena together. And that's where Alfredo became the technical director of a foundry. And it's also where they have their two children, both sons. First Alfredo Jr., who was known as Dino, and then Enzo 2 years later. And a few years after that, Alfredo started his own little factory near Modena's train station, and he employed a couple of dozen workers, eventually about 40, I think, who made things out of iron for the railway and the municipality. Imagine the sort of wrought iron canopies that cover station platforms, for instance, that kind of thing. And the original brick building of the Meccaniche Alfredo Ferrari now houses the Enzo Ferrari Museum.
So what you're actually saying, Richard, is that Enzo Ferrari's father was a smith.
Yes, that's true enough. And he did well out of it. He was also quite a cultured man. He could play the piano and the cello, and he liked taking his family, including the boys, to the theatre and the opera on a Saturday night. And it's interesting that during his teenage years, Enzo nurtured the ambition to become an operatic tenor. Imagine if he'd succeeded. Perhaps we'd never have heard of Luciano Pavarotti, who was another product of Modena.
Perhaps
Maybe
indeed.
Ferrari would have been one of the four tenors. Or
Yes.
There were. Anyway, Enzo and Dino, who was 2 years older, had a busy and happy childhood. They both enjoyed football and fencing and athletics and clay pigeon shooting. And Enzo liked reading and writing. In fact, he liked that so much that as a teenager, he even had a couple of reports on the local football team, Modena FC, published in the Gazzetta dello Sport, which was then, as now, the main national sports daily paper. But obviously his father's success provided him with a good example of running a business, as well as some experience of making things in a workshop. As for his mum, by all accounts, Adalgisa had a pretty volatile relationship with her husband, another example to Enzo. And their regular arguments, gave him an idea of how never to be afraid of a noisy row.
He certainly didn't back out of those over the years.
Yeah, with wives and drivers alike, I think.
All sorts.
But anyway, in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, the family was shattered by two deaths. First Alfredo's, then Dino's, and they were both from pneumonia. Dino, who was 20, had been serving as an ambulance driver at the front. And within months, Enzo was called up and found himself shoeing mules for a mountain artillery regiment.
Shoeing mules is a skill that is little practiced today.
Yeah, it's also a blacksmith skill.
Yeah, exactly.
Smith.
Exactly.
I imagine, look at all those racehorses and things. I imagine somebody can still do it.
They have to be shod.
They do. Anyway, when Enzo too went down with pneumonia, he thought it was the end. Understandably. In fact, he remembered the sound of coffins being hammered together outside the window of his military hospital. But he was spared, and he was able to return to his widowed mother in Modena. But now there was no longer a family business for him to run, and he was trying to work out where his destiny lay. It was his mother who got him an interview with Fiat in Turin.
Yes, and Fiat was the largest automobile manufacturer in Italy at the time, and a company that would later come to own a large chunk of Ferrari. But I am jumping a long way ahead, I know.
That's all right. We'll get to that. This is a story with a lot of threads that we'll try to disentangle. Anyway, Enzo's mother knew that her son had always been keen on cars. When he was 5, and only a couple of dozen people in Modena owned cars, the family had a de Dion Bouton. And Enzo was 10 when his dad took him to see his first motor race. That was the Coppa Florio, which was held on public roads beginning and ending in Bologna and passing very close to Modena. And the winner was one of the biggest names in those early years of motorsport, Felice Nazzaro, who averaged 80 miles an hour in a car made by Fiat. It was a stupendous sight, and Enzo was immediately hooked. So he arrived at Fiat on a winter's day at the end of 1918, 20 years old, just one of many demobbed servicemen looking for a job. And he was turned down. It was a desperate moment. He walked from the company's offices to Valentino Park on the banks of the River Po. He found a bench, sat down, and, in his own words, overcome by loneliness and despair, I wept.
What an amazing little story, thinking of, 20-year-old Enzo Ferrari in the depths of despair and depression in that way.
No idea of what was to come in
No
his life.
idea. Really an early foretaste of similar anecdotes in other worlds. And since you're a music man, Richard, such as the many that chronicle the man or men who said no to the Beatles, perhaps?
Yes, possibly so. But Decca never got the Beatles. At least Fiat got Ferrari
They
back.
got
in
their
a
man in
sense.
the end.
Yeah. Anyway, after that rejection, he stuck around Turin, living on a little money left by his father. And eventually, in a bar near the station, he fell in with a bunch of people involved in the motor trade, which was beginning to grow and become, an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And one of them had a little company stripping down war surplus light trucks and delivering them to Milan, where they'd be fitted with passenger car bodies for civilian use. He offered Enzo the job of driving them to their destination, and he jumped at it. He was in. Driving those cars might have been a bit drafty with no bodywork, but it gave him a chance to practice his driving as well. You can imagine. Not the roads can't have been very busy, and they probably weren't tarmacked either. So he could have a bit of fun.
Yeah, probably a little bit of power sliding if there was any power to be slid. Yes.
And pretty soon it was in a bar in Milan while he was waiting to return to Turin that he met a man called Ugo Sivocci, the chief test driver for a new car company called CMN. Sivocci needed an assistant, and he offered Ferrari the job, and that was a step up. And then, on October the 5th, 1919, Enzo made his debut as a racing driver, aged 21, in a 33-mile hill climb from Parma to Poggio di Bercetto, up a series of tricky hairpin bends known as the Piantone Steps. He finished 5th in his class, while Sivocci came 2nd overall. And that was a good enough performance for him to be entered alongside his boss in the Targa Florio a month later. The CMN team didn't have much money, so Ferrari and Sivocci had to drive their two cars down through Italy before taking the ferry to Sicily. And as they passed through the Abruzzi Mountains, Enzo had to use his pistol, which he carried with him underneath the seat, just in case, to see off a pack of wolves trying to intercept them.
What a fantastic story. Actually, according to one of my old bosses, Ron Dennis of McLaren, motor racing is full of piranhas, not wolves. I guess it amounts to much the same thing. But seriously, that little story does really illustrate how very different the world was, and therefore motor racing was 100 years ago.
Yep, it does. Anyway, Enzo finished 5th in that one, his first major race, and his career as a racing driver was underway. In 1920, he did a couple of races in an old Isotta Fraschini before taking a job as a test driver at Alfa Romeo, where the job specification included driving the company's very good racing cars as number 3 to 2 established aces, Antonio Ascari and Giuseppe Campari. Now he was even further in, and the results began to come. He came 2nd in the 1920 Targa Florio, and he won the production car class at a flying kilometre speed trial in Gallerati, not far from the Alfa Works in Portello outside Milan. And his first actual win came in 1923 at the Circuit of Savio outside Ravenna in an Alfa RL.
When he would have been, 25, something
Yep.
like that,
Yeah.
You mentioned Luciano Pavarotti earlier in the context of Enzo Ferrari once nurturing the ambition to become an operatic tenor. But Giuseppe Campari, whom you've also just mentioned, actually was an operatic tenor, wasn't he? Or was he a baritone or a tenor?
Tenor, I believe.
He was a tenor.
Yep.
And a fine chef, I believe.
A very fine chef.
And enjoyed eating quite a lot of the food he cooked as well.
Yes.
He did. Anyway.
Let's say he wouldn't have fitted into one of the 2025 Formula One cars. Not even two of them, probably.
No. Broad in the beam. Broad in the beam. Anyway, you definitely know more about music than I do, so I'm happy to be corrected that Campari was a tenor, not a baritone. Anyway, we digress again. So back to our story. Am I right in thinking that Savio, outside Ravenna, was where Enzo Ferrari met the family of a dead Italian fighter pilot who passed on the emblem of the prancing horse?
Yes, it was indeed. The family of Francesco Baracca, an Italian fighter ace and national hero who'd been killed during the Great War. That family, they took a liking to Enzo, and later they'd invite him to adopt the emblem of the black horse that had been painted on the side of Baracca's biplanes. And a week after that race, that victory at Savio, Ferrari's career at the wheel reached its peak when he won the first ever Coppa Acerbo over the 15-mile circuit in Pescara, a classic circuit.
The same roads that Stirling Moss won in 1957?
Indeed so, the very same, from the seafront up to the mountains and back again. And to do that, Ferrari had to beat a couple of Mercedes. By that time, he'd also got married. He'd married Laura Garello, a pretty and very sparky dancer whom he'd met while out walking near the station in Turin. She was 19, 2 years younger than him when they met. You'd have to assume he picked her up, wouldn't you?
Yes, probably.
Or maybe she picked him up, who knows? Anyway, they'd been living together for 2 years, much to the disapproval of both families before the official ceremony.
Of course, Italy was a very Catholic country in those days.
Very Catholic, yes. And Enzo had been baptized a Catholic too. And his mother was particularly against the relationship. And it's easy to imagine that a woman suddenly and tragically deprived not only of her husband, but her eldest son, would be perhaps a bit suspicious and resentful of someone taking possession of her surviving child.
For sure.
And the dislike was actually mutual. And even before the wedding, Laura had suffered some sort of nervous breakdown and took to spending lengthy periods in Rimini, at the seaside, to relieve the stress. But now Enzo was also meeting and working with important figures inside racing. He was getting embedded at Alfa, for instance. And these were men who'd have roles to play as he built his own company. Engineers like Vittorio Giano and Luigi Bazzi. Those were two guys who he'd persuaded to join Alfa from Fiat. And then, of course, there was the ace of aces, Tazio Nuvolari, who was the overall winner of the 1928 Circuit of Alexandria, in which Ferrari won his class. That year, Enzo also won his home race, the Circuit of Modena. And alongside him, they used to have riding mechanics in those days. There had to be two of you. And alongside him in that race was a man called Peppino Verdelli, who later became his chauffeur and sort of lifelong confidant. But Enzo's career as a racing driver was already winding down. There had been a big hiccup in 1923 when he was entered for the European Grand Prix at Lyon in France. But he caught the train home from that very rare excursion outside Italy after just a single day's practice. The reasons remain unclear, but apparently he was daunted by the power and speed of the Alfa P2, which was actually a pucker Grand Prix car. Maybe he was also responding to Laura's increasingly vocal desire to have a husband who wasn't putting himself in harm's way quite so often. And after that strange episode, his appearances at the wheel became sporadic. And his last race of all actually came in 1931, when he and Nuvolari, both at the wheel of beautiful Alfa Romeos, finished second and first, respectively, Nuvolari first, in the Circuito Tre Provinci. By then, the cars were being entered by the Scuderia Ferrari, and they were wearing badges with the prancing horse against a yellow shield, which was the colour of Modena, where they had their headquarters. And Laura was now 5 months pregnant with their first, and as it turned out, only child, which must have been a factor in his decision to stop.
It probably was. Just to be clear, because sometimes I think not everybody seems to understand this, is that Scuderia Ferrari ran Alfas during that
They
period.
did. We'll go on to talk
We'll
about
go on
that,
to when they started running
explain
Ferraris,
that.
but that's later in the story. Anyway, we've done Enzo Ferrari as a driver, haven't we? So was he any good? Or let me put it this way, Richard. Comparing him to two other giants of motorsport and Formula One outside the cockpit, was he a Colin Chapman? In other words, very quick indeed. Or was he a Bernie Ecclestone? In other words, not very quick at all.
Well, it's quite difficult to say in the light of all that. He wasn't an Ascari or a Nuvolari, that's for sure. He was good enough to win big sports car races, but not Grand Prix, I'd say. So maybe a bit more like Eddie Jordan or Christian Horner than Bruce McLaren or Jack Brabham.
Fine,
He discovered his limitations as a driver. You know, he loved the idea of being a racing driver, but he found the limit and decided that there was a better way of expressing his love of motorsport and making a living from it as well. That was important. But I have to say, anyone who raced in those days, in those conditions, deserves respect.
Absolutely, in those conditions and with that constant danger. I'll just say, you mentioned Eddie Jordan just then, and I think we should just pause to say how sad it is that we've lost him. I was quite close to him, and I'll miss him. He was clever, kind, funny, mad, irritating, but very lovable. But that's another story and perhaps another podcast, actually. Anyway, what Enzo Ferrari's comparatively short time spent as a racing driver also gave him, I guess, was the best possible appreciation of what makes a racing driver and what it is that they do and which ones are very good and which ones are merely good and which ones not so good at all, and how and why. And working, of course, with the great Nuvolari gave him the very highest of standards, or exposed him to watching the very, very best at work, when he had his own team against which to judge the drivers he would then go on to employ.
Indeed. And that feels like a good time to take our first ad break.
Have you ever wondered what goes through an athlete's mind before they step on the field? Or about the secret, superstitious pre-game rituals? Hi, I'm Isabella Rossellini. In the latest episode of This Is Not a Beauty Podcast, we'll speak to the barber responsible for the hairstyles of some of the world's greatest athletes to dig into how beauty shapes sports. Listen now on your favorite podcast platform.
Before we go on, here's some exciting news to share with you. For this season of And Colossally That's History, we wanted to do something for those of you in the Race Members Club. For those who don't know, the Race Members Club is the place to enjoy ad-free versions of this podcast and actually all of the other podcasts in the Races stable, plus bonus episodes, exclusive videos, special offers, and much more. The monthly cost is about the same price as a cup of coffee, so it's actually very reasonable. And as I say, this season we're going to do something special for the Race Members Club members. An exclusive Q&A episode of Colossally, as we like to call our podcast for short.
That's right. And if you're a member of the race, you'll be able to submit a question after each episode. We'll answer a couple at the end of each episode in Season 3, but the majority will be held back for a full-length Q&A episode, exclusively for members. So if you want to submit a question about Enzo Ferrari, head to patreon.com/therace and sign up to the Members Club. There's also a direct link in the description to this episode, and we look forward to answering, or trying to answer, the first of your questions in episode 3.
Indeed we do. Right, back to this episode, and as we've teased before the break, Enzo Ferrari's career as a driver was short-lived. I've seen multiple reasons given for why he cut his own driving career short, ranging from his own acceptance that he wasn't quite good enough behind the wheel, actually, as you've already hinted, Richard, to his desire to lead a safer way of life after the birth of his beloved son Dino in 1932. But, Richard, is it also fair to say that the shocking deaths of two racing drivers who he'd rubbed shoulders with also had an impact on his desire to stop racing.
More than two, actually, Matt. But you're probably referring to Ugo Sivocci, who gave him his first break with the CMN team, and Antonio Ascari, who was Alfa Romeo's number one when he joined them as a driver in 1920.
I am indeed. That's who I was referring to, yeah.
Good guess. Well, Sivocci was killed at Monza in 1923 while he was testing Alfa's new P1 Grand Prix car, not long after winning the Targa Florio. And Ascari was leading the 1925 French Grand Prix at Montlhéry when his Alfa P2 brushed a fence and turned over, landing on him and inflicting such injuries that he died on the way to hospital. Those were guys that Ferrari was close to, both of them. He'd also seen how Antonio Ascari had become a successful local distributor of Alfa Romeos. In those days, the companies didn't have their own distribution networks, so they depended on people.
Yeah.
And Ascari did that. And Antonio's son, Alberto, who was 7 years old when his father died, would become the Scuderia Ferrari's first world champion in the 50s. And very cruelly, he'd die while he was testing a Ferrari 30 years after his dad.
And of course, we'll come to that.
We will.
Yeah.
And, back then, death was something, sudden, violent death was something familiar to everyone involved in the sport. Giuseppe Campari, another close friend who, as you said earlier, shared Enzo's love of opera and good food, he was killed in a Scuderia Ferrari Alfa in the 1933 Monza Grand Prix. That was a very black day on which two other drivers, Stanislav Tchaikovsky in a Bugatti and Bakunin Borsacchini in a Works Maserati, both lost their lives, one of the blackest days in motor racing up to that point.
Appalling.
And Borsacchini had also driven for Ferrari's team. It's easy to say that the value of human life was a bit different then, but there was certainly a different attitude, and no doubt what he saw in the 20s and 30s explains why Ferrari could cope with the deaths of so many drivers, many of them his, without packing it in.
Indeed so. I always find the story of the death of Antonio Ascari, Alberto's father, particularly poignant. Mortally wounded, as you say, in the French Grand Prix at Montlhéry in 1925, he was carried to an ambulance in which his riding mechanic, 23-year-old Giulio Ramponi, travelled with him. I say riding mechanic, but in fact the only reason why Ramponi wasn't in the car with Ascari at the time and therefore wasn't involved in the fatal accident himself and therefore might have been killed himself was that riding mechanics had just been outlawed in some races. But Ascari died en route, and we gather that he breathed his last in Ramponi's arms. Racing was very tough indeed back then. And actually, although it was tough and it was regarded as tough, I suppose the First World War wasn't that old. So people like these young men were used to this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah. Anyway, let's now talk about how Enzo Ferrari became a businessman, Richard.
Well, he actually started his first company in 1920. When he was only 22. It was based in Modena. It was called the Carrozzeria Bodybuilders, Emilia, the Carrozzeria Emilia. And his idea was for customers to buy...
Coach builders. Bodybuilders are muscle men, I believe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, like you.
They were bodybuilders, but coach builders is a safer word.
All right, okay, coach builders. Right, fine, okay. Anyway, the idea was that customers bought a rolling chassis, and the running gear, including the engine, from a manufacturer like Fiat or Alfa Romeo, and then they got Enzo Ferrari's company to fit them out with custom-made bodies, or coachworks, if you prefer.
Yes.
And that was common practice back then. If you bought a Rolls-Royce or a Bugatti, quite often you got a specialist coach builder to design and build the bodywork. But Italy was going through a post-war economic recession when he launched his company, and the business went bust within a couple of years. And at that point, his doting mother sold some of her furniture to pay his debts.
Wow.
So you can see he hadn't been left a pile of money by his dad.
No, absolutely.
If they were having to do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, he wasn't discouraged. His relationship with Alfa Romeo was very good, and he became the company's distributor for the Emilia-Romagna region. And if his wealthy customers wanted to race their cars, he now had the experience and the reputation to help them. And something else he had in Modena, he had access to a tradition of artisan skills that exist to this day. If you want to get something made in metal, that's the place to go, made by hand. He'd seen how it worked in his own father's company, and now he set up a business with a workshop on the Viale Trento e Trieste, near the centre of the city, and he and Laura lived in an apartment above the shop. But by 1929, he was working on a new scheme. With encouragement and the promise of financial support from a couple of gentleman drivers from Bologna called Alfredo Cagnato and Mario Tardini, he approached Alfa Romeo with a plan to run their cars under the banner of a team to be known as the Scuderia Ferrari. They agreed and took a small shareholding.
Enzo Ferrari was always good at gathering friends and associates around him, in fact, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, it was one of his great gifts, I think, especially when it came to his business. He may have cultivated an air of mystery and remoteness in later years, the Pope of the North, but he was actually a very convivial man. He spent, with his friends, with people he knew.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time in the bar of the Hotel Real, close to his workshops, and he liked a bawdy joke, and he enjoyed particularly arranging big end-of-the-season banquets that made everyone feel good about what they'd been doing. He was a tough negotiator, but he was a fair one, and he didn't cheat people. And right at the beginning, he did something very brilliant, something that laid the foundation for just about every subsequent team in big-time motor racing. He approached Bosch, who made spark plugs and electronics. He approached Pirelli, the tyre manufacturer, and he approached Shell, the oil company, and he asked them all to support his new team with money and equipment. All of them pitched in, and in effect, they became his first sponsors.
So actually he invented sponsorship in motor racing.
He kind of did, yeah. I mean, in those days, the names wouldn't have been on the bodywork, but those companies could advertise their connection with a winning team in newspaper ads and on posters and on banners around a circuit. It wasn't like using Grand Prix cars to advertise cigarettes or condoms or cryptocurrency. All the companies invited to back Ferrari in those early days, they all made things that were actually used on the cars.
Yes, and it worked.
It did indeed. 3 months into that debut season of 1930, the great Nuvolari gave the Scuderia its first win in the Trieste Opicina hill climb. Then Luigi Arcangeli won the Circuito Tre Provinci and the Circuito Senigallia. And Baccanin Borsacchini won another hill climb.
I must say, your Italian is getting a good workout today.
It certainly is. Oh, I do my best. It all comes from reading the football reports in the Gazzetta dello Sport.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Enzo was always very aware of the value of publicity, and the projection of the team's image was already something he considered. He really liked journalists. I mean, he'd had a go at being a journalist himself at the beginning, and he often kind of enlisted the support of journalists. I mean, later in life, he even made two journalists, Franco Lini and Franco Gozzi, who became sort of confidants. He made them team manager of the Grand Prix team. Imagine if Ron Dennis had offered you the job of team principal of McLaren when you were working there as head of
Strangely,
comms.
that never happened.
How differently things might have turned out.
Better, mate. Better. They would have worked out better.
Of course they would. We'd never have heard of that bunch who are putting them on the front row now. Anyway, one thing he did at the end of each season, he published the first of his yearbooks, which summarised the year's achievements, make him look, this was substantial stuff. And that's a tradition that's actually still going today.
They still send me one every year.
Do they?
Yes.
Nice. Hang on to it. They're worth something.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got a 1958 one. That's worth a bit. Anyway, so in 1931, the Scuderia entered their first proper Grand Prix at Monaco and the Nürburgring. And in 1932, they had their first wins in really big events, when Nuvolari won the Targa Florio and the Coppa Acerbo in Pescara. And in 1933, Nuvolari won the Grand Prix in Tunis and Tripoli, and the Eifelrennen, which was a big race at the Nürburgring back in those days. But the cars were being outclassed by their rivals from Bugatti and Maserati. And Nuvolari suddenly left the team when his request that it be renamed the Scuderia Nuvolari Ferrari was turned down.
And, well, understandably so. Was Enzo right to turn that down? Was that an unreasonable request at the time from Nuvolari?
Well, I think it probably was.
So do I, actually.
Imagine if Max Verstappen asked for the team to be renamed Verstappen Red Bull. Probably quite justifiable, but there we are. Or maybe it should have been Verstappen Newey Red Bull for the last few years. Never mind.
Another podcast.
Another podcast. Anyway, the break came after Nuvolari had also demanded, again unsuccessfully, to be allowed to race a Maserati under the Scuderia's colours in the Coppaciano at Livorno. Ferrari said no and carried on preparing Nuvolari's usual Alfa, which was ready for him at the circuit. Instead, Nuvolari turned up with the Maserati, which he'd bought and smuggled into the circuit, and he won the race.
A real, kind of V sign to Enzo
Sure
Ferrari.
Was, and it did not go down well.
Yeah.
And Ferrari got his revenge a few weeks later when that Maserati with Nuvolari was leading the Italian Grand Prix until a tyre blew right in the closing stages, which handed the victory at Monza in front of the home crowd to Luigi Fagioli in the Scuderia Ferrari's Alfa.
There you are. Payback.
Yep. So he'd lost Nuvolari, but the arrival of two new drivers, Achille Varzi and a young Algerian called Guy Moll, meant that Ferrari wasn't exactly short of talent in the cockpit.
I mean, Guy Moll died young. Great driver. Very talented.
Yeah, very talented.
Very much so.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Could have been one of the greats.
Could have
he was
been.
in his very early 20s. And he started the season by winning the Monaco Grand Prix and the Avusrennen in Berlin, before being killed during the Coppa Acerbo in Pescara later in the season. Varzi, who was Nuvolari's great rival and absolutely his polar opposite in everything but the ability to win, took the Mille Miglia, the Targa Florio and the Tripoli Grand Prix, and Louis Chiron of Monaco won the French and Moroccan Grand Prix. So, they were building up a series of wins.
They were indeed. And it is a cliche to say that the drivers back then were more colourful characters than they are now. But, they were, weren't they? I mean, the fact is they were. I mean, you've just mentioned Varzi, who became a morphine addict, and Chiron, who started out as a gigolo, basically a male prostitute.
Are you saying that today's influx of very young Grand Prix, are you saying they disappoint you as characters?
I'm not saying that I would like them to take up either of those professions or lifestyle choices, if anyone's listening, but they do make interesting sidelines to their racing career.
They do. Anyway, for 1935, thanks to an intervention by none other than Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, Nuvolari was back with the Scuderia in time to record the greatest of all his victories. In the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, he beat the crushingly dominant Silver Arrows from Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union on their own turf in front of 250,000 fans in lederhosen and milkmaids' dresses, all of whom had come to drink beer and celebrate a home victory. What they actually saw was a display of Italian virtuosity in an outclassed car that left Adolf Hitler's motorsport supremo having to make a very uncomfortable telephone call to his boss. And that's a race, probably the greatest underdog victory in the history of Grand Prix racing, that we'll go back to in depth when we devote an episode of the podcast entirely to Nuvolari, as we certainly will.
We certainly will. And but I will just say one extra detail. For now, the organisers were so unprepared for Nuvolari's victory that they didn't have a record of the Italian national anthem ready to play after the race, did they?
No.
And but Nuvolari always carried a spare for luck, and he provided it in time for it to be played nonetheless. One can imagine that Hitler was not amused.
I should think not, but how funny that Nuvolari carried a 78 RPM disc of the Italian national anthem around with him, just in case, they haven't got one because he was expecting to win. I mean, I hope he took 2 or 3 because I remember 78.
So do I. They were very fragile.
We're
not talking about vinyl, pre-vinyl.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Shellac.
And of course, second in the race was Manfred von Brauchitsch, who was very high up in the kind of Nazi. Well, his family was at high command, so probably adding insult to injury that he was the one who failed to beat Nuvolari's Alfa.
Yes, I think there was fury, actually, that day. But
yes.
anyway, but, that day was the exception, and the German onslaught meant that the Scuderia's successes were now generally restricted to second-rank events, apart from the Mille Miglia and the Targa Florio, which were the big sports car classics. Alfa reacted by deciding that they wanted to regain a bit of control of their racing effort for 1937. So they bought a bigger share in the Scuderia Ferrari, 80%, and sent Ferrari a talented engineer called Gioacchino Colombo. And together, Ferrari and Colombo recognized that they were unlikely to be able to compete with the German teams in Grand Prix racing. So they concentrated most of their efforts on designing a car for voiturette racing, a sort of Formula 2 for cars with supercharged 1.5-litre engines, in which they could compete with the Maseratis and Bugattis. Colombo started work in Modena at the workshops on a single-seater with a straight-8 engine, to be called the Tipo 158. He'd wanted it to be rear-engined, like the Auto Unions, but Enzo told him very sternly that as far as he was concerned, the ox should always be pulling the cart. Had you ever seen it the other way around? So the Tipo 158 would have its engine in the traditional place in front of the driver.
Enzo Ferrari remained wedded to that view for quite some time.
Quite some time, long after it had ceased to be fashionable or even practicable.
Which we will come to.
But then at the start of 1938, Alfa's chairman announced that all further work would be done not in Modena, but at Portello, Alfa's factory in Milan. Enzo would still be running the team, but the Scuderia Ferrari and its Modena base would be effectively shut down. In Milan, the task was made a lot harder for him by the presence of a new head of design, a Spaniard named Vilfredo Ricart, who had strong ideas of his own, and Enzo hated him on sight. In his memoir, he wrote about Ricart's sleek, oiled hair and his way of wearing elegant clothes with a somewhat Levantine air. Quote, "When he shook hands," he wrote, "it was like grasping the cold, lifeless hand of a corpse."
You can tell he was a journalist originally, can't you?
Indeed. Nor was Enzo getting on very well with Alfa's chairman, a man called Ugo Gobato. Quote, "Gobato believed that a racing car should be the synthesis of all the products of all the departments of a big works," Enzo wrote. Quote, "I took the opposite view. He hated having to adapt himself to sudden changes, while to me the act of the makeshift was almost part of my religion." So that relationship couldn't last. The Tipo 158, which was a really good car, won on its debut at Livorno that August 1938 in the hands of Emilio Villaresi, and it carried on winning races in 1939. It really was a great car in its formula. But the relationships were crumbling, not least when Ferrari didn't turn up to a top-level strategy meeting at Gobato's summer home in the Dolomites. And on September the 6th, 1939, 6 days after Germany had invaded Poland, Gobato wrote to Ferrari to thank him for his work and to sack him with a hefty financial compensation. And under the severance deal, whatever he did next, Ferrari was unable to use his own name for 4 years.
Of course, the war would then make that not very bad a punishment.
Indeed.
Yes.
Well,
anyway.
Drew its teeth.
Yes, exactly. Of course, in hindsight, being sacked by Alfa Romeo was a great thing, in fact, for Enzo Ferrari, because it set him on a different and very successful course. But at the time, war or no war, there was a lingering resentment from Ferrari towards Alfa, I think, wasn't there? And did beating Alfa become a strong motivation for him, therefore? I mean, was he a man who harboured grudges in that way?
Well, I don't think he was a small-minded man, but he definitely didn't forget an insult. And in this case...
Well put, yeah, I think that's right.
And in this case, he'd definitely get his revenge eventually. But Italy hadn't yet joined the war, so his idea was to find a way of carrying on. And with the money he got from the settlement, he formed a new company called Alto Avio Costruzioni. And he and his designers, two guys called Alberto Massimino and Valentino Bellantani, began work on a sports car with an 8-cylinder engine, 1.5 litres. And they aimed it at the 1940 Mille Miglia, which was to be run over several laps of a shorter course, starting and finishing in Brescia. And they built 2 of those cars. It was called the 815, and it had lovely flowing bodywork by Touring of Milan, the coach builders. And one of those cars was to be driven by Alberto Ascari, the late Antonio's son, who was now 21 and showing great talent. And it demonstrated that it was a very fast car during the race, but both cars retired, and they left the win to the German BMWs.
May I interrupt you with our second Anorak fact of Series 3, please, Richard?
You may indeed, Matt. Go ahead.
It is a real Anorak fact, I have to confess. It's this. The Auto Avio Costruzione 815's 8-cylinder engine was made by the conjoining of 2 4-cylinder engines from the Fiat 508 Balilla. I can see you glazing over. Bear with me on this.
Not at all, no.
Bear with me on this.
That Fiat Balilla is a beautiful little car.
Beautiful little compact road car.
Yeah.
And that 4-cylinder Fiat engine, eventually bored and stroked to 1100cc, went on to power, if you can use the word power, the Fiat 1100 of 1953, elegant little 4-door saloon, which remained in production until 1969 and whose tooling was then shipped to Bombay, now Mumbai. I told you this was an Anorak fact, where the Indian car company Premier fitted it to its Padmini model, itself based on the Fiat 1100. And the Premier Padmini continued in production in India right the way through to 2001. Now, I happen to know this because when I first went to India in 1993, and particularly to Bombay, now Mumbai, I saw Premier Padminis everywhere, and they were the staple taxi, and I rather liked them. I rode in them as taxis, and I actually drove one. I borrowed one off Auto India magazine in order to have a go in one. And actually did some sideways cornering shots for their magazine. This is going back a long time. Anyway, whenever I was in a taxi in a Premier Padmini at that time, I was always tempted to tell my taxi driver that his right foot had control of half of the engine that had powered the first ever car to be designed and built by Enzo Ferrari. But I actually never did say that.
You didn't.
I didn't.
Really?
Should I have done?
I think we can call that an Anorak factissimo.
You've invented a new category.
And I'm now deglazing from it. Anyway, back to our story. 6 weeks after that Mille Miglia, Italy joined the war and everything changed. Suddenly no one was making racing cars anymore. No more racing. So Ferrari had to adapt in several ways, mostly by keeping his head down and finding ways to preserve and build his business. He stopped thinking about cars and started manufacturing machine tools, particularly grinding machines for making ball bearings, at a new factory he built in 1943 on land he'd bought outside Maranello, a small town 20 kilometres from Modena, famous for nothing at that point. Inevitably, some of those ball bearings found their way into machinery that helped Mussolini's war effort. But Ferrari joined the fascist party eventually only when it became mandatory in order to get a permit to travel abroad. He didn't go abroad much, but he did once or twice. He expressed no political views in public, but he did do things like saving a Jewish lawyer, a friend of his, from a beating from fascist thugs. And then when the Nazis occupied Italy a bit later in the war, he helped the partisans by allowing fugitives to hide in a barn on his property and by permitting his workers to repair rifles and making metal spikes to throw under German trucks. He also had to cope with his new factory being occupied by the Nazis, who tried to send his grinding machines to Germany. And then he had to cope with being bombed by the Allies twice in the last winter of the war.
So to be clear, he joined the fascist party not because he was a fascist by ideology at all, but expediency.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. He was being pragmatic.
Yes.
And he survived. unlike some, who included his friend Eduardo Weber, the carburetor manufacturer, who was a fascist. I mean, a proper fascist.
Was he?
Real fascist.
Yeah.
And Ugo Gabato, the Alfa chairman. Weber was disappeared, and Ugo Gabato was shot outside the factory gates by the partisans.
Shot dead.
Shot dead.
Yeah.
Enzo Ferrari was said to have been on their list too, for execution for whatever reason. But this was a post-war chaos of accusations and counter-accusations. When you could, if you got somebody you didn't like, they could say, "Oh, you could say, oh, he was a fascist." And
it was a way of getting someone you didn't like bumped off.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's probably significant that Enzo lived through, survived through that. And in May 1945, he could celebrate not just the end of the hostilities, but the birth of a second son. It wasn't to his wife, Laura, though. It was to a woman called Lina Lardi, with whom he'd been having a relationship since 1929. Quote, "A man must have 2 wives," unquote, he once said to a friend. And Lina was the one without the official papers. The boy she had was called Piero. He was brought up by his mum, first in an apartment in Modena, and then in a house in the nearby village of Castelvetro, which Enzo provided, and Enzo visited most evenings on his way home from Maranello. Only his closest friends knew about his second family.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was a bittersweet addition, this second son, because Ferrari would already have known that Dino, his first son, had been suffering more or less since birth from a genetic defect called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which was a wasting disease from which most sufferers died before they reached 20, and now he was 13. But Ferrari, in the middle of all this, he had to get on with rebuilding his business, and at last he was free to build cars with his name on them, bearing the badge of the prancing horse.
And that feels like a good time for another quick break. Today, Ferrari is known as one of the most famous automobile marques in the world. But it wasn't until 1947, was it, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, that Enzo Ferrari established Ferrari as a proper automobile manufacturer and initially as a racing car manufacturer.
Yes, at first he'd thought of resuming his business as a maker of machine tools, which is what he'd been doing during the war. But he got talked out of it by Gioacchino Colombo, his old chief designer. The first car to carry the name Ferrari saw the light of day in March 1947. It was a lightweight 2-seater sports car intended for racing, with a beautiful little 12-cylinder engine of 1.5 litres designed by Colombo. And this one wasn't based on a Fiat. It was a thoroughbred.
I've got no India-based stories.
You know, so sorry. No taxi anecdotes. The project actually got a boost from a man called Luigi Chinetti, a pre-war double Le Mans winner who is now a wheeler dealer in the exotic car business in New York. According to Chinetti, he visited Ferrari in December 1946 and told him that there was potentially a big market for exotic European sports cars waiting to be exploited in the USA. He added his voice to those urging Ferrari not to go back into machine tools by telling him that if he made 5 cars or even 20 cars, he'd guarantee to sell them all to Americans.
Without a 25% tariff?
No 25% tariff. No. And that certainly helped Ferrari to decide that the best way to pay for the expensive business of running a racing team was to sell expensive road cars to wealthy clients. But they'd need the publicity boost from a successful racing program. One would feed off the other. And so it has been from 1947, when 4 Ferraris were built, to the 2020s, when getting on for 10,000 cars a year, maybe a little more now, leave the factory.
Yeah.
That very first Ferrari, the 125S, made its competition debut on May the 11th, 1947, at Piacenza, in the hands of Franco Cortese, an experienced driver who'd also been doubling up as Ferrari's travelling machine tools salesman. It had been finished in such a hurry that there wasn't even a badge on the bonnet. But Cortese set the fastest lap in practice and was leading the race when his fuel pump packed up with 3 laps to go.
Franco Cortese actually holds the record for the most finishes in the Mille Miglia. 14 finishes, and that is an anorak fact.
Impressive
anyway,
too.
Very impressive. I'm going finishes, not just starts, but he finished the race 14 times. Actually, I'm going to stop announcing anorak facts on this podcast, Richard, because the depth of your knowledge of Enzo Ferrari's early career is so profound that everything you've said so far is an anorak fact, and I'm loving it, mate.
Well, I hope I'm not stifling one of your principal pleasures of this activity. There we are. Anyway, that's very kind. And rather surprisingly, Enzo Ferrari wasn't there to see Cortese race the 125S. He was at home waiting for his sporting director, a man called Federico Ghiberti, to call and give him the results. This was a habit he got into before the war. He went to test sessions sometimes and sometimes to the practice days at Monza, but he no longer attended the races themselves. It was almost as if the fear of seeing his machines fail was stronger than the hope of seeing them succeed.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But of course, when things went wrong, it meant he relied on his team manager telling him the truth about what had happened, which wasn't always the case, as we'll see.
Welcome to the world of PR.
Yeah, and PR and Formula One in particular.
Yes.
2 weeks later, anyway, Ghiberti was able to call with better news, this time from Rome. Cortese had won the race on a circuit in a public park around the baths of Caracalla. A car called a Ferrari had won its first victory.
A great day.
A very great day. And Cortese actually won 3 more races over the next few weeks, and that was enough to bring Tazio Nuvolari back into the fold. He and Enzo made a deal, and straight away he was winning races again, including one in Parma, where he judged a beauty contest on the night before the race. And he stalled his engine on the grid, made his way from 14th to 1st, and invited the new Miss Parma, Signorina Parma, into the passenger seat for the lap of honour.
As you do.
As you do. And it was with sports cars that the team had its first big successes, starting with the 1948 Targa Florio, which was won in a new model, the 2-litre 166, by Clemente Biondetti and Prince Igor Trubetskoy, an exiled Russian prince. The first of the aristocratic and celebrity customers who added a layer of glamour to the Ferrari image. Trubetskoy had actually bought his car with money given to him by his wife, the Woolworths heiress Barbara Hutton.
And that reminds me, actually, that those who remember or listened to, or both, our podcast that we did in the last series about American teams may remember that Barbara Hutton was mentioned, because she was the mother of Lance Reventlow, who raced a Scarab, and it was actually her money that he used to build and race it.
It was indeed.
There you are.
Yeah. So later in 1949, Biondetti also won the Mille Miglia in a closed Ferrari Berlinetta coupe, while Nuvolari caned Trubetskoy's open cockpit car so hard that it had practically disintegrated by the time Ferrari persuaded him to call it a day at the Modena control towards the end of the race. Back at the factory, that car was rebuilt in time for Trubetskoy to take it to Monaco. This was the first appearance for a Ferrari in a proper Grand Prix, and the Count was trundling around quite respectably until he crashed. But the breakthrough to international success for Ferrari came at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1949, the first time the race had been held since the war began. Ferrari didn't want to enter it. He was afraid the cars weren't strong enough to last the distance, and he didn't want the bad publicity that failure would bring. But Luigi Chinetti talked him into selling him 2 cars, which he'd sell on to wealthy amateurs who wanted to race. And one of those buyers was a Brit, the young Lord Selsdon.
And that little anecdote there, I know you haven't finished it, but just if I may butt in, it underlines Enzo Ferrari's fear of failure as well as his appetite for success, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, it does. Yeah. I mean, there was something quite conservative about him as well. He didn't want to take that risk at that time. But anyway, Chinetti co-drove that car with the comparatively inexperienced Selsdon, and Chinetti ended up spending 23 of the 24 hours in the cockpit as they secured Ferrari's biggest victory to date, and it was the one that put the company on the map. Because now potential purchasers could see that Ferraris were not only fast and good-looking, but reliable, although the advertising didn't actually mention that Chinetti had finished the race with a slipping clutch and an engine leaking oil into the cockpit.
Maybe one day we should do a podcast on people who have really shouldered the lion's share of the Le Mans 24
That's
hours.
absolutely
Because
true,
there have
yeah.
been others who've done 20-plus hours, haven't there?
Yeah. One or two who tried to do it the whole 24, and one did, actually. That's a good subject.
Yeah.
Anyway, this time, when Ferrari had its greatest victory to date, again, Ferrari wasn't actually present in person. When the checkered flag fell, he was out walking in the hills above Modena with his older son, Dino, who was now 17 and in increasingly poor health. They'd taken a portable radio with them so that they could hear the results. And this, I think, was the day that Ferrari emerged from the pack in terms of stature and longevity. There were a lot of artisans building small sports racing cars in northern Italy in the 1940s. So why do we know the name of Ferrari today rather than those of Stangalini, Ermini, Giaur or Moretti? And I think it was because of his vision, his high standards, his ambition, and his ability to assemble an effective team. Even after he was made a commendatore, which is a sort of Italian knighthood, he preferred to be called ingegnere, engineer, even though he never actually designed so much as a hubcap. What he was good at was recruiting and motivating the people who could design those things.
Yeah, he summed it up, didn't he, in, maybe his most famous quote, which goes as follows: "I'm an agitator of men and machines." And if you think about it, that's the sort of thing that helped him build the success and the mystique, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. And soon he had clients queuing up at Maranello to buy the cars and to meet the man who made them. The Dominican playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, he'd get his American heiress wife, Doris Duke, to buy him 5 Ferraris, some of which he used for racing. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was another early customer for Ferrari's road cars and used to make the journey, the pilgrimage, to the factory. So did the Italian film director Roberto Rossellini, who delighted Enzo by bringing along his lover, the Swedish actress Ingrid Bergman. They came to meet the man who was an enigmatic figure, a man behind dark glasses, whose rare pronouncements, like that one about being an agitator, carried the weight of scripture. And there was plenty of agitation to come. Ferrari's next task was to conquer Grand Prix racing, where Alfa Romeo had returned in triumph with the Alfetta, the model conceived in the Scuderia Ferrari's workshops before the war as the Tipo 158. And when the first World Championship Series was held in 1950, the supercharged Alfas steamrolled their way to 6 wins in 6 races, not counting the Indy 500, which was then included in the series. Nino Farina became the first Formula One world champion, ahead of his teammates Juan Manuel Fangio and Luigi Fagioli, the 3 Fs, as they were known. Ferrari competed in all the races that season except the very first at Silverstone, which they didn't make because Enzo felt it was too expensive to send a team all the way to England just to get a beating from his old sponsors company. After struggling in the remaining races with his own supercharged 1.5-litre car designed by Colombo, Ferrari listened to another of his designers, Aurelio Lampredi, who came up with an unsupercharged 4.5-litre V12. Pitting his engineers against each other was one way of agitating his men to greater things.
Yeah.
At Silverstone in 1951, a year after the no-show, it made the difference. Lambredi's Ferrari 375 was good enough to take on the Alfas, and in the aggressive hands of José Froilán González, Fangio's young friend and fellow Argentinian, it was good enough to beat them. In front of a packed crowd on a fine summer's afternoon, it was a historic victory. Ferrari actually described his own reaction in typically operatic terms, seeing the win in terms of beating the team that had given him his first real opportunity as a racing driver and then as a team organiser, and that had helped to nurture his dreams. Quote, "I cried for joy," he wrote in his memoir, "but my tears of enthusiasm were mixed with those of sorrow, because I thought, today I have killed my mother."
What a great quote. And it reminds me, your stories about 1951 Silverstone, it reminds me of your friend and mine, the great TV commentator Murray Walker, because he was at Silverstone that day. And over a nice lunch once near his Hampshire home, I once asked him what he thought of the race, and he replied as follows, and which answer impressed and amused me so much that I jotted it down in my notebook when he popped to the loo. And it's as follows. "Gonzalez was a big lad," said Murray. "In fact, he looked like a barrel of lard with an inverted pudding bowl on top. He was just this great dumpy figure jammed into the car, flailing away at it. I wouldn't say he was driving wildly, but occasionally he hit straw bales and things." Good old Murray. I loved "and things" then, and I still love it now. Very Murray quote, isn't it? Anyway, I saw that car being driven at Silverstone too, and so did you, Richard. We weren't there with Murray in 1951, obviously. Even you aren't that old. But we were both at, although you were alive. You were alive, yes, which I wasn't. Yeah. Anyway, but we were both at Silverstone in 2011 to see Fernando Alonso demo drive it in Ferrari's 60th anniversary celebrations. It was a great thing to witness.
Yeah, lovely, handsome car. And
absolutely.
I think Fernando enjoyed the experience.
He did, and it was in great condition because, of course, at that time it was owned by a rather wealthy man. One Bernard Charles Ecclestone, but it's actually recently been bought from Bernie by Mark Mateschitz, the son of Dietrich Mateschitz of Red Bull fame. Anyway, back to 1951, by which time Ferrari had become a Formula One race-winning manufacturer. Richard, was that British Grand Prix victory in 1951 as meaningful at the time as it has become now, with hindsight?
Yeah, I think it was. It was a changing of the guard. Anyone who brought Alfa Romeo's tremendous winning streak to an end was obviously a very serious proposition.
Indeed so. So it was all falling into place for Enzo Ferrari, and that feels like a good place to say, and colossally, that's history, and wrap up part one of our double-header on Enzo Ferrari. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to check out episode 2 next week, in which we continue the Enzo Ferrari story, or indeed pass on this episode to a friend whom you think might be interested.
And remember, we'll be answering a couple of your Enzo Ferrari questions at the end of episode 3 of this season. So if you'd like question-asking privileges and the opportunity to listen to our end of the season Q&A episode, head to patreon.com/therace to join the Race Members Club.
Absolutely, please do that. And if you'd like to get in touch with something other than a question for us to answer on the show, you can send us an email at podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop us a line via social media. I'm at the Bishop1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947. I should add, we've really enjoyed catching up on all your correspondence between seasons, between season 1 and 2 and between season 2 and 3, and we're sorry we can't respond to every single one. And that goes for all your kind reviews on Apple Podcasts and your comments on Spotify as well.
So that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our producer and consigliere, Johnny Reynolds.
Thank you, Johnny.
And to you for listening. It's ciao from me.
And it's arrivederci from him.
And colossally, that's
History.
The Athletic.